Hello and welcome to today's Strategy Imagination Forum. I'm Anna Allen, Senior Program Manager of the Strategic Management Society. And now I'm delighted to introduce our session host, Will Mitchell.
Good morning to you all, and thank you, or whatever part of the day it is for each of you. Welcome to the top of the hour. It's wonderful having you here. Thank you so much for joining us. This is part of the SMS's commitment to having thoughtful conversations between academic scholars and business practitioners, and it's a true joy to have you here with us today. I'd also like to welcome some special guests to this conversation. Jim Laurie and Mark Maybury from Stanley Black Decker, John Haley from Willis Towers Watson, Alok Loya from Indorama, and Ricardo Vargas from Bright Fellow. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have your engagement and your insights. And at this point, let me introduce Martin Reeves. Martin has been kind enough to agree to share his insights with us today and serve as a point of contact for the discussion. Martin is the global chair of BCG's Henderson Institute. Martin, you've been at BCG for a little bit more than 30 years, I think, which seems like a long time. Currently senior vice president, living in San Francisco after a long time in New York. And this year going from one hotspot to another hotspot. I think you previously had a couple of years at IC Agrochemical, if I understand correctly. And Martin is a very thoughtful speaker, writer, engaged with books on adaptive strategy, book on your strategy needs a strategy. It's been highlighted in a TED Talk, been highlighted in HBR, and just involved in publishing an incredibly timely piece of work in HBR on recovery and leadership in coronavirus. And if one thing we've learned over the last few months is the importance of leadership, this is definitely a huge time for us to understand the importance of leadership. And not just the importance of leadership, the importance of imaginative leadership, which is the topic for Martin today, is basically how to bring imagination into our strategy rather than simply become stale. And Martin, let me turn it over to you. I'm so pleased to have you here. In terms of ground rules, Martin's going to talk for about 30 minutes with his insights. Please fire in questions to the Q&A panel in your Zoom session. And either at the end of the 30 minutes or possibly as we go, I'll bring up the questions and we'll engage in a conversation with Martin through the Q&A. So please do actively use the Q&A panel and raise questions that you have in mind. Martin, once again, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's early in the morning in San Francisco, and I really appreciate you setting up for this.
Thank you, Will. Can you see my screen?
Loud and clear to me.
Very good. Well, thanks to the SMS for inviting me to this inaugural meeting of practitioners and academics to discuss emerging topics in strategy. It's really great to see that happening, of course, because strategy was originally an applied art where practitioners and theoreticians got together to discuss the issues of the day. And you know, I hope that this is the first of many of these forums. So today I'd like to talk about a book which I've written, but which is not out yet. It'll be out early next year, called The Imagination Machine, which is essentially about the role of imagination and ideas in strategy, an aspect of strategy that has perhaps been neglected in the sort of dominance of the planning model of strategy. So the basic idea is that nothing of value in business is created without imagination. Every large company has messy entrepreneurial origins. And in fact, for the research for the book, one of the things we've done is we've constructed what we call a napkin gallery, which is artifacts, photographs of the first sketches of things that later became big, sensible, financially attractive. And you know, without exception, every large company we look at has messy entrepreneurial origins. Somebody somewhere thought of something that didn't exist, probably mostly implausible, gave it a name, persuaded people that it was worth investing in, worth buying. And so we're interested in that spirit and how to reintroduce that into strategy. So here's one of the exhibits from the Napkin Gallery. which will release with the book, which is an early sketch by Jack Dorsey of Twitter. This is the earliest sketch we can find of the idea of Twitter. And you can see it's very messy, it's very human, it hasn't fully evolved yet. So the question is, what's going on here? And if you want more of this to be going on, how do we do that? And how does that fit into the strategy process? But let's begin with why. Why now? Why do we really need this? Well, the most proximal reason is that we're, of course, in the middle of the COVID crisis, and the history of pandemics and wars and recessions would say that sometimes we have shallow cyclical recessions that don't really change much. The world returns to its previous state, but mainly crises do affect people's behavior, people's beliefs, people's values, and we see opportunities for innovation and reimagination of business. And right now, I'm getting a surprising number of questions from large clients about reimagining business. So I see I've seen a wave of thinking spread across business during this crisis, beginning with what I call reactionary thinking, which is reacting to the to supply chain and health related urgent issues in relation to the crisis, and then recessionary thinking, how can we survive a period of lower economic growth, and then thinking about the contingency of the rebound of the disease and the rebound of demand. But about 23% of companies, according to my survey, are already thinking about all of those things and reimagining the business. And it's clear to many CEOs that that's what they need to do. They're making efforts to do so, but they don't really have the toolkit to do so, to figure out what are the unique changes that will occur as a result of this COVID crisis, and what are the unique opportunities to reimagine business. So that's one pull for this, which is reimagining the business in a crisis. A second one is, of course, I didn't know about the crisis when I started work on the book, is a sort of a longer term trend, which is when companies talk about growth, historically, they've often talked about participation in growth. In other words, they've talked about weighting their portfolios, their activity portfolios, to areas of the market that are growing. But for demographic reasons, long-term growth is trending down. So growth cannot merely be a matter of passively participating in things that happen to be growing. It must be more sort of proactively created through innovation and imagination. So that's one reason. The second reason is that the rise of what others have called hyper-competition, which is just the decline in the period of leadership or the period of advantage or even the period of viability of an enterprise over time. So on the right-hand side of the chart here, you've got our analysis of the TSR outperformance exponential decay rate of all public companies in the US, going back to about 1990, where we begin to see, presumably because of the ease of replication and evolution of digital business models and the speed of transmission of information, we begin to see a massive acceleration of the decay rate of competitive advantage, which of course means that we either need to reconcile ourselves to the fact that large companies will die sooner, to be replaced by startups in the next wave of large companies, which seems rather wasteful, or companies need to reinvent themselves more continuously, and of course that's not new. A lot of words have been said about that, but I think potentially the new aspect of that is to think about the mental part of that. What are the where do ideas come from? How do ideas get scaled? How do minds communicate? And how do we somehow harness the power of human imagination in business? A third reason is a different type of decay, which is not the decay of advantage, but the decay in a company's capacity for growth. So every year for the last couple of years, we've published a different type of index with Fortune magazine called the Fortune Future 50, and it aims to measure what we call the vitality of companies. So most high-level metrics that companies use are essentially measures of performance, which are measures of backward-looking viability. So we may measure profitability or productivity, but this is the efficiency of what has already happened. If you like, the measure of the effectiveness of the historical exploitation of the advantage of a company. In the era of the rapid decay of competitive advantage, we really need a forward-looking metric of vitality, which is the capacity for growth and reinvention. So essentially, we constructed an index which was predictive. It contained 16 factors, predictive of future growth, and it comprises 16 factors, and some of those factors are structural. For instance, large companies tend to grow less, and as you can see from this chart, older companies tend on average to grow less. Some cultural factors, for instance, external orientation, whether most of the company's attention is directed externally or not, is a very strong predictor of growth. Technology is a major driver of growth, so predictors of technological health and so on. Human resources, diversity at the top does actually drive growth potential. So what we see is a systematic decline in the potential for growth of large companies as they age and grow and get more complex and get more focused on exploiting yesterday's business model. But fortunately, this is not inevitable, as you can see by the spread around the line. Another reason for this, for thinking about imagination in business is the art of how to revitalize companies, how to actually measure and manage the vitality, the capacity of growth of companies. And then the last reason, a very important reason, is the shifting boundary between technology and humans. So previous waves of general purpose technologies have changed the boundary between human work and technology, but the cognitive revolution does so in relation to the mind. So routine mental work, routine managerial work potentially gets replaced by artificial intelligence, which begs the question, well, what do the humans do then? And so Google has an explicit policy of migrating human cognition to high levels of value added. In other words, to refocus humans, to focus algorithms on routine work, and to focus human cognition on more creative tasks. So this chart is from Kai-Fu Lee's book, AI Superpowers, which is a great book, where he says basically the two unique things that machine learning cannot do or will not be able to do for some time are the creativity and empathy or sociality. So while there may be a synergistic relationship between AI and human cognition, on the whole, we need to shift human cognition, what the humans do in corporations, to these dimensions, more unique human dimensions of creativity and sociality. So the question that the book addresses then is how do you do that? So let's start off with definitions. So what do I mean by imagination? So this is adapted from the mathematician Judea Pearl's book on causality. So he distinguishes between three types of cognition. We have correlative thinking, which is if X happens, what else happens, which is essentially the domain of machine learning or gradient descent. It's the domain of correlation. We have causation, which is what causes Y to change, X causes Y to change, which potentially is computationally tractable, but as Pearl says, statistics has not been designed with that directionality in mind, and therefore statistics is in the process of being reinvented so that we can get at not just correlation but causation more easily. And then we have the domain of the counterfactual, which is the idea that what if we changed X? What would happen if we changed X? Thinking about things that could be the case that happen not to be the case. And of course, things that are not the case but could be the case don't have any data associated with them. So almost by definition, we can't do machine learning on the things that haven't happened yet. And it turns out that this ability to think counterfactually or to imagine is actually uniquely human. So we have some scientific asides. We've interviewed scientists on the science of imagination for the purposes of the book. And so primates do have the ability to imagine the use of a tool that is in their field of vision, but it's only humans that can imagine what you might, a new use of a tool or a new potential invention where the tools or the elements are not actually in their visual field. So that's this uniquely human capability that I'd like to think about harnessing. And the book is not about imagination, it's about harnessing the imagination, putting that to use. So the argument is that in the long run, most value in business is created through growth. Theoretically, it could come from efficiency improvement or something of that nature, or asset productivity, but most long-term value comes from growth. Most of that comes from innovation, and that is driven by this capacity for imagination. So how do we more systematically manage imagination? So how does imagination work? I think the Romantic period in the arts did us a great disservice, because it gave us an image of imagination as something that perhaps is a bit like this, a portrait of Wordsworth, something which is momentary, a flash of inspiration, something that is mainly invisible because it occurs inside somebody's head, something that is very individual and perhaps relies on rare powers of genius. So it's the domain of a Steve Jobs story, not the domain of something we can all do. And probably the domain of the unmanageable. The Romantic vision of the imagination would regard it as absurd that we could aspire to manage the imagination. Of course, we beg to disagree. There'd be no point in writing a book if we didn't disagree. So we don't see imagination as being some predictable mechanical affair, but business deals with the management of quirky human traits and capabilities in many guises, and we see no reason in principle why imagination can't be one of the things that a business more systematically harnesses. So the basic framework of the book, and I'd like to quickly tick through each stage in the process that we propose to manage imagination. It has 6 stages, and I'll illustrate each of these with a practical example. The first stage is really the triggering of imagination, caring enough and noticing that there is a possibility of a better version of reality. So you might call that the inspiration or the trigger stage. Then there is the rethinking stage, where we deploy this unique human capability of constructing a new mental model of the world. And then we have an action stage where we take some action based upon that, so that we don't just have a private fantasy, we actually do work in the world with the results of the imagination. And then we move to the top layer of the chart, which is a social stage, where we have the propagation of ideas, the amplification of ideas. And then we have the codification of ideas, which is, if you like, the industrialization of the products of the imagination. And then lastly, we have to do the whole thing again in order to maintain the viability of companies. So let me give some brief comments about each of these stages and how they can be better harnessed. So inspiration is one of the key factors in our vitality model is external orientation. Companies that are mainly internally oriented don't notice changes in the world and therefore cannot adapt to or shape what it is they don't see or care about. Brain scientists like Freston point out that we update our mental models, we imagine when we encounter surprise. So this first stage of the triggering of the imagination is all about encountering surprise. So here's an example of an interview that we did with a book from the founder of the company Churro. Churro is a company that rents out private cars, often high-end cars. So basically, I borrow your Ferrari for a couple of hours is the business model of Churro. And we talked to him, as we talked to many entrepreneurs, about, how did you come up with that idea? And essentially it was a story about him biking through the snow to reach the closest Zipcar station that wasn't very close at all, passing tens of unused private cars along the way, and getting very frustrated by, why on earth can't I hire one of these cars? And so this, I think, gives some clues as to this stage. It's about different types of surprise, anomaly, accident, or analogy. So in this case, it's about the anomaly that, why can't I rent these cars? It's also about caring about those anomalies. One could have the passing thought, why can't I rent these cars? And then bike merrily on towards a Zipcar station, or one could get very frustrated about that. Shelby is an idealist. He gets very frustrated about things that don't work as they should, or don't work as well as they should. And so those are some of the things that are important in this stage of inspiration. And those are, if you think about it, very potentially manageable things. Leadership can modulate the degree of external orientation of the company. They can model the observation of anomaly. They can even go, as some companies are doing right now, they could even explicitly chase anomalies in their analyses of emerging opportunities during the COVID crisis. So if the first stage is a collision between the mind and reality, the second stage, rethinking, is about constructing new models of reality based upon that, new mental models. And here's a wonderful example from our napkin gallery. It's a mental model of the Disney business drawn by Walt Disney in 1957, and just incredibly prescient. He has this detailed snapshot of what the business could be and what the relationships between the businesses could be that turned out to be an uncannily accurate portrait of what Disney became. And this is the capacity. This is a tour de force in the ability to think what if, and in shaping strategy. And when we talk to entrepreneurs and business creators about how this stage works, one of the key things here is the awareness that our mental model is not reality, but actually having self-awareness of mental models, the ability to entertain multiple mental models, the ability to think counterfactually, cultures which actually encourage that to be the case, training managers in how to do that. So again, we have a whole bunch of things that we can increase the imaginative capacity of our corporations by taking certain interventions at this stage. The third stage is acting. If we don't act upon the imagination, we have creativity therapy. We have an interesting brainstorming session that doesn't go anywhere, but we need to take action. And Friston points out that there are really 5 things we can do once we've been surprised, once we've encountered one of these anomalies that causes us to update our mental model. The first one is mental. We can update our mental model to better explain the anomaly. The second 2 have to do with perception. We can actually relocate so that we can focus more on an interesting phenomenon, or we can refocus our perception to look more closely at what is going on. We can collect a different type of data. There's a lot of that going on right now in what I called anomaly hunting during the COVID crisis. We can focus our perception to find out more about things that look interesting, or we can experiment. We can manipulate the world in some way by saying, "Let me try this," or we can communicate our model to others and have the model potentially become their mental model. Much has been written about experimentation. I won't say a lot about that, other than to say that there's a new aspect of experimentation, which is the automation of massive parallel A/B testing, which is going on, which changes how experimentation works. But we take action not only to experiment, but we take action also to generate new surprises. So the question here is not only did it work, but what further surprises did it generate? And so here we see the first two products of the Sony Corporation after the Second World War, both capitalizing on observations made at the time. So one observation was that people really wanted to eat rice, that rice was in short supply during the war. It became a luxury. And so the awkward-looking wooden pail on the left is the world's first electric rice cooker. And on the right, we have the transistor radio deploying the newly invented transistor. The product on the left didn't really work very well. It gave very uneven cooking results, didn't really catch on. The one on the right was extremely successful and opened the door to a whole era of miniaturized portable electronic devices that were the basis for Sony's prosperity for many years. So let me press on in the interest of time. So the fourth stage is when we get social. If an idea is not shared, then it doesn't gather co-developers. It doesn't get understood. It doesn't generate demand. It doesn't get funded. And many corporations have well-honed tactics for preventing the spread of ideas and mental models. So principal among them are functional silos, the prevention of the communication between the different parts of the organization, and also norms of what it is sensible to talk about. So when I make a proposal in business, there is a certain standard of what is sensible. And if that standard is a 30-year NPV calculation, then we're not going to have many new ideas. And I've actually seen that occur in many instances in corporations where ideas are killed because essentially they're subject to norms which close down these messy early stage ideas. I was invited to spend a week with the company Recruit in Japan. Here's one of their events in Japan. The whole company is really designed to socialize imagination. So Recruit is a services conglomerate. It's a serial business model innovator, and they have a research center which thinks about how ideas propagate. And so here's one of the events. It's called the Ring event, which is just one part of their HR system, whereby the employees get together and share contingent thoughts, what could be the case in new business models. So the company has several interesting things about this. Anyone can participate. Any idea, there's a stage gate process. If there is one follower, if you have an idea and one follower, the first stage funding is automatically guaranteed. There's a deliberate philosophy at work here, which is the whole event is modeled on the idea that anyone can do this. So it's to model the process of innovation. And the HR function has an explicit policy also of making the heroes of the firm, of the entrepreneurs, the Imagineers in the firm. So the most well-known, you can walk around this firm and you can say, tell me about Yamazaki-san, and everybody will be able to tell you about the guy that invented the last successful business. If you ask, who's the head of finance, who's the head of HR, people may or may not know. There's a celebration and a recognition, and the whole HR system is built upon that principle. The fifth stage is codification. There may seem to be nothing further from imagination than the writing of the standard operating procedure, but somebody somewhere has to replicate and evolve an idea that wasn't involved in the messy creative process. And not surprisingly, we find some of the best examples of this in the franchise business, where essentially the game is to hand over a manual to a franchisee and have them be able to replicate the product. So here we see one of the first branches of the company which invented the food franchise business, the White Castle hamburger chain in 1916. And interestingly, you can see that what they're selling here, the name on the shop is not White Castle Hamburgers, it's the White Castle Hamburger System. So the codification is actually the thing which is being sold, because at the time, processed meat didn't have a very sanitary or attractive image, and selling the replicability of the quality and the hygiene was part of the value proposition. And so actually one of the founders was the creative genius behind this, and the other one was essentially an expert in the art of codification. So one of the chapters in the book deals with the really surprisingly subtle art of codification, because if you think about it, one needs to capture the essence of an idea without overwhelming with detail in ways that replicate the key qualities of success, but in ways that don't stifle initiative and evolvability. And that's a pretty tough thing to do, but I think we know a lot about how to do that, and that's an essential part of the imagination process. And then finally, we need to repeat the whole exercise, and I think the strategic ambidexterity is now a well-established concept in strategy academia. Unfortunately, according to our calculations, only about 3% of companies are ambidextrous. They're able to exploit with advantage and explore with advantage. So one of the chapters in the book deals with the ways of achieving ambidexterity, and not only structurally, but also in terms of the process for challenging existing ideas and mental models and refreshing mental models, a process for ambidexterity of ideas, if you like. Finally, to wrap up, a few observations on how all of this changes strategy, the theory of strategy, and also more particularly, because the book is for practitioners, the practice of strategy. So here's a framework from my last book, Your Strategy Needs a Strategy, that essentially says that we may have a popular image of strategy as planning, but in fact, strategy, according to the circumstances, can be planning, it can be adapting, it can be envisioning new possibilities, as I've talked about today. It can be collaborating in ecosystems to collaboratively reshape the world. It can be renewing the advantage of a company. Essentially, what I'm talking about is a shift from the left to the right of this chart, a more emphasis on mind in addition to action, more emphasis on creation rather than positioning or reacting, and more emphasis on shaping one's fate rather than reacting to what is. So I think that it's necessary and possible that we put more emphasis, not exclusive emphasis, but more emphasis, a more balanced emphasis on these aspects of strategy moving forwards. Then lastly, the technology-human boundary. We have a chapter in the book on a couple of aspects of this. So obviously the encroachment of machine learning on routine cognitive tasks is one of the reasons why we need to refocus human cognition on imagination. Now, you could ask the question, just as the holy grail of machine learning is general artificial intelligence, could we have such a thing as artificial imagination? Well, that's even further off, and most people would say no, but we do begin to have some interesting AI tools which actually facilitate imagination. So you've probably read about this AI-designed new sport, which has been turned into a real physical sport, a ball game called Speedgate, which is very entertaining. We've had paintings that have been constructed by AI, which have sold for vast amounts of money. And these are cheating a little bit because, of course, a human programmed the programs for each of these, and also selected from the 1,000 outputs of the machine, the one that looked interesting to human beings. But nevertheless, we begin to see, and we interview in the book some entrepreneurs of software companies that begin to produce tools which facilitate the human imagination. So, for example, I'm publishing an interview today with Bob Goodson, the founder and the CEO of Netscape, of Quid, the semantic analytics company, a former classical scholar. And so basically he has a tool that can suck in vast amounts of semantic information and create visual maps that facilitate the detection of the anomalies, which are the triggers for the imagination. So in his own mind, he is producing a generation of tools which are complements or facilitators of the human imagination. So I think we can see that boundary shifting further as things move forward. So I'm not talking, so the intersection between imagination and technology, I think, is important. And then lastly, I think another implication of what I've talked about today is an evolution in how we think about transformation. So corporations search for successful business recipes. They optimize those recipes. They specialize around those recipes. And then when their business models decay or they become too complex, they need to transform. And typically we transform for complexity reduction or cost reduction or repositioning. I see the need for a different type of transformation, a different type of reset, which you might call transforming for revitalization, which is transforming to revitalize the ideas, the idea processes of companies. So I don't have time to go through this in detail, but there are a number of practical things one can do at each of these stages that I talked about today, the 6 stages, which could transform in a short space of time the imaginative potential of the individuals in a company and the processes in a company. So let me pause there and hand it back to Will and take any questions or comments that may have come up.
Martin, thank you so much. I mean, I really like the combination of thoughtfulness, of structure, and imagination of pushing us and drawing from ideas that many of us recognize. And there's comments. I see comments in the chats and comments in the Q&A panel about how this links to ideas that we recognize, and putting it together into a formulation that both pushes us and provides a structure that we can work with. So this is a really powerful combination. Before I go to questions, I just want to say how happy I am to see so many friends, old friends and new friends, on the participant list. And I'm just going to, Hugh Courtney, it's great to see you here. You've been involved in both many sides of this world for so many years. And I really want to call out 2 people from the SMS connection on this. Dan Schendel is the founding president of the SMS and one of the people who have really helped create this field and have got us where we are now. And coming to the other extreme of the SMS, Africa Carino is here as the president-elect of the SMS. So we have the beginnings in the early 1980s and we have the future in the 2010s. And so thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to pick up, rather than pick up on specific questions at this point, I want to pick up on some of the themes that I'm seeing across the questions in the Q&A panel and in the chat panel. And Martin, let me put one thing to you, and you started to touch on this in the talk, but see if you can amplify it. Imagination is important in both as a routine part of what we do, if you can imagine imagination being routine, but sort of rather than waiting for a crisis, having imagination to be proactive and getting us ahead. Imagination is also important in a crisis, the things that we can't anticipate. COVID obviously is a good example, a huge example of that, but this is part of life, is unanticipated needs. How would you compare and contrast the use of imagination and your structured approach to imagination in those 2 situations, sort of proactively setting ourselves up and reactively responding quickly to unexpected needs?
Well, it's a bit like the paradox of strategies of innovation, I think, isn't it? Which is innovations are things that by definition we don't know the new thing that we might invent or might work, but that doesn't mean that we can't have strategies for putting ourselves in the way of serendipity or exploiting serendipity. So there are structured anticipatory activities, I think, that can make us more susceptible and more capable of seeing potential when we bump into it. And in particular, I see this during the companies' reactions to the COVID crisis. So some companies are asking basically purely reactive questions, which is, how do we cope with what is coming at us? Others are going out and saying, what are the trends? What are the emerging trends? But they're still essentially asking a passive question. Others are saying, given what we've seen in previous crises, given that what we could plausibly imagine to be the case, what is shapeable here? So I think that the answer to your question is it's partly the degree of proactivity and anticipation that we apply to such events. But I think the thinking is essentially the same. So what I'm proposing is a framework which would either be good for anticipatory innovation and imagination, or reacting to unexpected anomalies. And the reason that's the case is, in essence, what I've proposed is a structured process for hunting down and exploiting anomalies.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. So let me pick up on your point around COVID. I mean, because this is a real-time lab. We've got hundreds, thousands of companies around the world actively engaging with COVID, some, as you say, reactively, some proactively. Can you build on, and you've just published the work on COVID and leadership and recovery. Are any examples top of mind of companies that you think have been particularly effective in working within the environment that we're in now?
Well, many of the I think as time goes by, we'll see more and more examples. But many of the examples that we can codify right now are coming out of China, simply because it has this multi-week, 6 to 8 week lead on many other nations. So we do see. I do see a number of things in China. So I do see that in the decline phase, there wasn't very much competitive divergence. So in the shock phase of the crisis, there wasn't very much competitive divergence. During the recovery, as we've seen in previous recessions and crises, we see massive competitive divergence. And some of that is based upon resilience. Some of that is based upon the ability to restore damaged functionalities quickly. Enormous competitive spread there. But others are driven by innovation and reimagination. So some interesting examples that come to mind. So the spontaneous emergence of ecosystems which coordinate supply chains based upon social media platforms, orchestrated not by the largest companies, but often by medium-sized companies, I think is a very imaginative act that appears to be very profitable for the companies engaged. I think there's so many interesting things going on in China in this respect. Another one is thinking about the boundaries of strategy beyond the company is another sort of trend I see. In other words, thinking about temporarily loaning employees to other contracts, to reallocate labor across different parts of the economy, to think about that as being a cross-company sort of strategic move that one can make. One sees we're seeing a lot of that in China, and many other similar innovations. Now, some of this is going on sort of in a fairly informal way, but some companies really are getting quite systematic, I'd say a minority, about hunting down the anomalies. So one company I spoke to said, look, the people at the coalface in our company are being forced to adapt to change circumstances and change customer needs. And I expect that's also true of my competitors. My competitive advantage is that I care to capture that variance and the results of those experiments, and to scale and codify and give a name to what works, and to embrace and amplify it. And that this particular company was using big data techniques to granular high frequency data to hunt down these anomalies. So crisis, differential recovery, partly driven by innovation, partly driven by systematic practice, and that's the thing which the book hopes to address.
Thank you. That's outstanding. You know, I'm looking at the themes that are coming up in the Q&As and in the chats, and there's a couple of themes that are emerging that I think are very, very important. One is around sort of organizational processes that allow one to become imaginative, and another is about the role of the individual leaders and other people throughout the organization. And let me start with the sort of the structural process question. Set of questions. You've identified 7 steps that would take us towards moving from seeing gaps and seeing opportunities through to be sustaining responses. And in some sense, there's a sequence there. But I'm curious about how you think of an organization learning to follow that sequence. Do you start with step 1 and then work through, or do you have any thoughts around how an organization can learn to put this set of steps together into an actionable framework?
Well, I'm sure that we'll see many different ways of putting together. The title of the book, by the way, The Imagination Machine, is a deliberate tease. It sort of says you thought you couldn't manage innovation, but perhaps you can. And it sort of says that ultimately the corporation creates value through imagination. So the corporation is a human creation, a machine, if you like, for doing imaginative work. And so, I think you're asking sort of basically, how do you construct an imagination machine? Well, I've given you a somewhat comprehensive view of that, but if you ask me a different question, if you say, what is the minimum toolkit to take a relatively unimaginative circumstance and change it into a more imaginative context, I'd say it's 2 things. I'd say it's mental process, and I would say it's social process. So in some companies, they talk about market share and industry as if they are real things. In other companies, they talk about the construct of, or the idea of, or the alternative model of. There's a self-awareness that models are not reality, and that we can think contingently. We can do counterfactual thinking. I find in a highly financialized world, that's not the norm. So I think that the norm in companies, in a highly financialized company, large company, would be that we talk about reality and financial yield. We talk about these things as if they're facts. We don't indulge in counterfactual thinking. But it's very important, because the next opportunity for exploitation will initially be something which is a creation of the mind. So that's trainable. I use games for that, but also for the next thing, and I'll say more about games in a second. So the other one is social process, which is legitimacy is very important, because when you say something, when you have an idea that is either legitimate or illegitimate in the context of your company culture. And I've noticed that large corporations, especially large Anglo-Saxon corporations, often have a very, they might self-describe it as a very practical or pragmatic way of looking at things, which means that you're not allowed to talk about things that are imprecise, that don't have existing examples, that don't have a financial model associated with them. So that's a cultural norm. So the sociality of acceptability of ill-formed thoughts, I think, is very important. So how do I deal with that practically? And this is something that's come together over my career, actually. I noticed something. I've been doing strategy at BCG for 30 years as a practitioner, and I noticed that a very curious phenomenon, which is you can put the right people, give them the right questions, give them the right resources, give them the right amount of time on a strategy process, and still strangely come out with an elaborate rationalization as to why the existing strategy or some minor variant on it is the right strategy. Somehow we get stuck in mental paradigms, even given intellect and resources and questions and stimulus. And so I've come to the conclusion that you can't really construct a new strategy unless you first break down mental models. So I have what I call 10 pre-strategy games, and I call them games because play, I define play as a lapsed biologist as de-risked accelerated learning. I call them play quite deliberately. These games are social games and intellectual games that are designed to break down hidden assumptions and to foster counterfactual thinking. And my observation is that if you try these games before you go into the formal strategy process, you're likely to come out with a more interesting result. So coming back to your question, I think the really simple version of this is play strategy games which encourage the sociality of ideas and counterfactual thinking, and that will change everything. And then the subsequent formalization of all of the steps of that is if you like, a nicety, something that makes it better.
Thank you. That's really useful. So let me pick up on this in terms of the who. So we talk about games, talk about leadership, individuals involved in the socialization. How much of this can be created by the C-suite, the top management team? Can it be done alternatively in a kind of a skunkworks fashion from down somewhere in the guts of the organization? Or to what extent, if you're doing games, if you're engaging people, how broad does the span of people need to be in this process to really move towards having an imaginative organization?
Well, I think it needs to be somewhat of both. Obviously we can think about a cartoon where the CEO says, please follow my instruction and be imaginative immediately. There'd be a paradox there. But we could also imagine the dystopia of, do whatever you like, be creative, show up at work if you like, think of things that are physically impossible if you like. That's fantasy, that's not imagination. So it's like adaptation. Adaptation is profoundly local, but also profoundly global. Somebody somewhere has to try something, observe something, care about something, have a thought. But that thought needs to be subjected to scrutiny, to social evolution. So I had a fascinating interview with the head of AI at Google, who pointed out that the modern conception of invention as being patentable and the product of individual thought is actually a peculiarly modern invention. And he has on his wall a picture of the evolution of arrowheads, different designs for Stone Age arrowheads. And the point he's making is that if you look at the whole loop of machine intelligence or innovation, it's a profoundly social process. Ideas which are not embraced. I mean, theoretically, you could have the ultimately valuable idea that's embraced by nobody and no value is achieved. Ideas as a minimum have to be embraced, and they probably have to be co-evolved too. So I think Recruit is probably the best example. The Recruit company I spoke about is probably the best example of this, where they have a deliberate policy that you could call top down, it's sort of like middle down, where they do have processes and procedures which facilitate and catalyze and structure and fund imagination. But the ultimate emphasis is on what they call entrepreneur heroes, which is the people that take an idea and do something with it. So that's the trade-off or the compromise or the synergy between top down and bottom up. I think neither but both essentially is the answer.
Okay, thank you. So let me stick on the theme of people, and this has come up in several of the questions and comments. To what extent do we make my current MBA students happy and say we need to recruit new people, we need to select new people with new mindsets to do this? And to what extent do we make my graduate MBA students who are already working happy and say that we can bring people who are already working into the company and sort of reshift their way of thinking and engage them as imaginative leaders in imaginative processes inside their company? So to what extent does this have to be new selection, and to what extent can this be re-engagement of existing employees and existing staff?
I think there's a huge potential for re-engagement. But there is an intersection with diversity and cognitive diversity here. So we've done some work, which we talk about in the book, with a company called Pymetrics. Pymetrics is So typically HR departments do personality testing. They test suitability for jobs based upon psychology and personality tests, you know, Big Five and Myers-Briggs and all of that. There is this alternative discipline, neuroscience, where you don't ask people their opinions about their attitudes and propensities. You actually measure their responses in games. For instance, you measure their ability to judge uncertainty under noisy conditions. It's a physiologically measurable brain trait. And there are about 90 of these that are well documented. So what Pymetrics does is it measures neuroscience traits, and it then assesses suitability for jobs, even new categories of job, because there's a feedback loop. Did this person do well? Okay, what profiles do well in this job? What skills do well in this job? So one of the interesting things we did is we have a strategy game based upon my last book, which is a universal strategy simulator. It's a Bayesian multi-arm bandit algorithm that's able to simulate more or less any strategy in any environment. And the wonderful thing about this is it's an app, and when people play it, they generate data. So we can ask questions like, who does well in this game? Who does well in that game? We married this with the Pymetrics neuroscience games, and we asked the question, are there neuroscientific types of, is there a neuroscience type of strategist? Does strategist have a definable, a distinguishable neuroscience profile? And what we found was that that universal strategists that were good in solving many different types of strategy problem were extremely rare as ambidextrous companies. What we found instead was that you needed different profiles for solving different types of problem. So, analysis of well-defined problems would be, one neuroscience type. Imagining new possibilities in the absence of any empirical evidence would be a completely different type. Rapidly adjusting the effectiveness using rapid pragmatic adjustment of existing models, it would be a different type. So basically you get to the conclusion that others have come to, which is a healthy company needs cognitive diversity. And so coming to your question, there's probably more there than you're utilizing, because your social norms, your cultural norms are probably suppressing certain maverick types, certain misfit personality types in your makeup. And over time, you probably attrit the people that are not happy there. You probably, attrit the creative non-financial types that are just not happy in a highly financialized, mechanized company. So I think there's a new science of team composition and of embracing diversity and multiple paths to success, which involves measuring different things, celebrating different types of success, worrying about team composition. That is a key aspect of everything we've been talking about today. Thank you.
I think your point about mavericks has made pretty much everybody in this session happy, because if I look at the list of names in the participant list, I see a lot of people who not only think of themselves as being mavericks, but are in fact mavericks. One last question, and we're hitting 11 o'clock, and I'd like to respect people's time. I want to take it from the individual to the macro. And the macro, in the sense that competition is an amazingly powerful force. Competition changes industries, competition changes functions, competition changes skills, and competition changes balance of power across the globe. And we've hit inflection points in which competitive dynamics have led to major change many times, and we're certainly at one now. We think about pre-COVID, during COVID, post-COVID, we're clearly in a competitive inflection point. And I'm curious about your insights about which types of industries, which types of countries are likely to be imaginative leaders coming out of COVID and are in a position to reshape the competitive positions of industries, of companies, of countries around the world?
Well, I think there's a fashion to take a new idea and add the notion of competing on that dimension, and there's probably too much proliferation of that. But I would say that I think it is possible to compete on imagination. I think one of the patterns I've seen across my 30 years of being a strategy practitioner is that the less managed and codified a competitive mechanism is, the greater the competitive spread on that dimension, the greater the potential. And I think we, you know, in the COVID crisis, two that jump out at me as being under-leveraged aspects of competition. One is resilience. I mean, everybody cares about resilience, talks about resilience, but we don't really have a playbook for how do you measure and manage resilience. And the other one is imagination, which is what is the systematic process of managing and exploiting ideas. Companies which adopt so some companies will be lucky, right? They will, through necessity, they'll be driven, or just by sheer luck, they will, you know, happen upon a new way of doing business. But what we're really interested in is taming that by making it repeatable and more predictable. And so I think that competing on imagination by systematically managing the process of imagination, I think, is a huge opportunity. Where will that occur? Well, I'd like to say this country or that industry, but I don't think that's the answer. I think that the answer is that, you know, as others have pointed out, the variance of performance within industries is usually about 10 times greater than the variance across industries. And I think we can see that competitive spread within industries in the instance of COVID. So I think it will be, you know, companies that don't lose what, you know, Bezos calls, you know, the day one mentality, that don't lose their humbleness, that don't lose sight of their messy entrepreneurial origins, that don't take for granted the perpetuity of their business models. So that sort of paranoia or humbleness, I think those sorts of companies. Probably companies that can feel the danger. I mean, having scale and a big cash cushion, it sort of insulates you from the, you know, from the urgency that an entrepreneurial company might feel of necessity. And so I think, you know, we've seen a lot of innovation coming out of medium-sized companies in China, ones that can still fill ones that are not so fragile they can't afford to take any risk, but that are not so large that they can still feel the risk. I think that I think that this shifting boundary between human cognition, machine cognition will put some technology companies in play on this front. My conversations with Google on the topic have been fascinating. Clearly, they're thinking about far more than the machine learning algorithms. They're thinking about, well, what do the humans do too, and can we facilitate some of those creative dimensions with technology? They're thinking more broadly than just about the technology. So I'd expect to see surprises coming from some of these places.
Cool. Martin, thank you so much. We could go for much longer, but again, I want to respect people's time, respect your time, and respect all our participants' time. Thank you for the insights, and thank you for taking so many ideas, putting them together in a logical way, and giving us something that we can work with.